So I'm just going to go over so we can get into the data. And let me just start telling you a little bit about the study of mathematically precocious youth. SMPY, as we call it, was founded by Julian Stanley back in 1971 at Hopkins. It was actually, the stimulus for the study was actually a young man called Joe Bates, who was 12 years old and was taking an engineering class at Hopkins and was performing much better than all the freshmen in the class, the 18 and 19-year-olds in the class. And at the end of the class, the instructor, Doris Litke, thought, what do I do with this person? And decided to take a walk down the lawn and talk to Julian Stanley to get advice. And Julian was intrigued. And he thought, well, if this 12-year-old is taking classes with college freshmen, I wonder how he would do on the SAT. So he gave them the Scholastic Aptitude Test, which, for those of you who are not in the US and used to our testing system, was taken by high school seniors before they go off to college. Important information in terms of college admissions. So he decided to give a test that was designed for individuals 4 to 5 years older to see what would he do. And he was stunned to find out that this individual scored extremely highly. And so they worked, he worked with him and developed some interventions to do with him. And he thought this was just one of those strange cases that will never pop up again. But there was a mother. And you know mothers. She had a boy, and she said, my son is just as smart as this Joe Bates. Julian said, no, I don't believe that. But he said, there's one Joe Bates, but there can't be two. The mother insisted that her son was just as bright. And Julian, because you know how insistent we mothers can be, Julian decided, well, I'll put an end to it. I'll give him the SAT too. And he won't score as well, and that'll do it. To his surprise, this boy also scored extremely highly. That prompted Julian to say, well, how many people are there out there with scores like this? How many mathematically talented youth are there who can score in the top centiles of performance compared to college-bound seniors? So they were in the top 5% of college-bound seniors. So he started a talent search, and all I could say is Julian was in his 50s when he started doing this, and so he had to have somebody to carry on the study. And here I was as a graduate student, lucky me. And then David joined me just a little later. Anyway, in a talent search, what we do is we have students take the SAT. Now, not everybody can take the SAT as a 7th or 8th grader. It would be way too difficult. So we only invite individuals who we know already are in the top 3% on age-appropriate tests already administered by their schools. So we know that they're already in the top 3%, but as you can see by this slide, you cannot differentiate the top 3%. But when you give them this harder test that is designed for individuals 4 to 5 years older, you spread out the able from the extremely able. And of course, Julian, he focused on the extremely able. And my role in all of this was to kind of follow them up. And so here is the concept of the study. And I'm going to have to say, I had just gotten my doctorate when I had this great idea that I was going to do a 50-year longitudinal study. And I thought it would be really nice if the sociology department at Hopkins would let me be a courtesy assistant professor. So I came and presented, and Bob Gordon was in the audience. And I remember when I told them that I wanted to do a 50-year longitudinal study, they all kind of smiled and laughed and said, to be young and passionate and have ideas. I remember seeing those eyes. Well, I like to tell them that, hey, I've done it. We're almost there. Anyway, in the longitudinal study, and this is conducted by David and me, and since I'm a dean these days, it is mostly David these days who's doing all the work. So I just get to play around with the data sometimes, and he's very nice. But in the, in the longitudinal study, we have 5 cohorts. And you can see here by looking at the slide what the criteria are for identification, when they were identified, and their ability level. Let me just talk about the first 3 cohorts. And you can see that the first 3 cohorts were all identified with the SAT. They all have, and you can see that the first cohort was in the early 70s. The second cohort was identified in the late 70s. And you can see that there was a progression in terms of the cutoffs for who we were included. And the third cohort is our most able cohort. And then we decided, I'm just going to skip forth, we also decided later on, David and I, that you know what, you just can't study a sample identified by the SAT to see. We really need to have a sample identified by other criteria to see how well our findings generalize. So what we have in here is that we can replicate our findings with cohort 1, 2, and 3, and you can see that the sample sizes are quite large, so they're robust, but now cohort 5 is a different sample to see how well we can generalize. And I think with that, I turn it over to David, and I'll return a little later.
So we have these 5 cohorts of remarkably gifted kids, and we're interested in studying their development. How do we conceptualize them psychologically? And the way we've done that, I actually got a double PhD in counseling and experimental psychology, and the director of the counseling program, Renee Dawes, who is also my co-advisor, developed the model of the theory of work adjustment is the model he developed for conceptualizing vocational development. And one of the things Camilla and I have done is generalize this model to educational development, occupational development, and now lifespan development, creativity, and imminence. Basically, what this model says is to understand tenure, or this is not academic tenure, it's commitment to a career, a vocational path. You have to understand 2 things. You have to understand the individual in terms of their abilities and their passions, and you have to understand the environment in terms of the ability requirements and the reward system. This theory puts equal emphasis on assessing the individual and assessing the environment. Correspondence between abilities and ability requirements determines satisfactory students, workers. Correspondence between the individual's passions and the reward systems determines how satisfied the individual is with the environment. To the extent that these 2 dimensions are in place, individual is predicted to maintain contact with the environment. The environment wants them because of their competencies. The individuals want the environments because of the reward systems. The 2 aspects of the environment that we have to know about are the abilities and the motivational proclivities. I'm going to focus, because of this audience, on abilities and the importance of assessing individual differences in the top 1%. There's remarkable consensus in the literature that cognitive abilities are organized hierarchically. There's a general ability, IQ, G, general intelligence, a number of different names, but there are also 3 specific abilities, verbal, mathematical, and quantitative reasoning, that have differential validity for education, the world of work, and creativity, and they're very important to know about. Passions are also important to know about because they refine the developmental trajectory of the individual, but I'm going to focus on abilities in this talk. When individuals are in correspondent environments, we hear a lot of talk nowadays about flow, in sync, being in the zone. My parents' generation, it was in the groove. That's being in a dispositionally correspondent environment that challenges your abilities and is commensurate with your competencies. That's an optimal environment for you to flourish in. This is why Camilla and I generalized the theory of work adjustment to a more molar theory of talent development. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first focus on general ability. Doug Detterman and one of his students, Fry, have a lovely article in Psych Science in 2004 where they show that an SAT composite for high ability populations is an excellent measure of general intelligence. Here are over 2,300 of our participants who are all in the top 1% in general intellectual ability. All of these people have IQs of 137 or beyond. Now, top 1% contains 1/3 of the ability range, and for people who haven't heard that, it's pausing, but IQs go beyond 200. Do these differences matter? You've heard things like in Gladwell's book, other people say this, there's a threshold in ability. After IQ of 120, more ability doesn't matter. All of these participants have IQs well above 130, and their individual differences matter. The reason you don't see this in the literature is because of design constraints. To see these phenomenon, you need measures that are capable of differentiating systematic sources of individual differences within the top 1%. You need large samples because there are a number of different ways that people can show their intelligence. Life is ipsative. If you're going to invest in writing a novel, you're not going to probably become a physicist or secure a patent. So we need large samples, we need individual differences, measures that can differentiate the able and the exceptionally able. We need a heterogeneous collection of criteria with low base rates because we're after rare outcomes. So here, what we have done with these odds ratios is we've compared the outcomes of the top quartile of the top 1% with the bottom quartile of the top 1%, doctorates, STEM publications, patents, income in the 5th percentile, which is remarkable for people who are still in their mid-30s, and literary publications. These are refereed publications, and you see that more ability matters. Because Camilla and I are especially interested in the development of STEM talent, and because we wanted control for education, what we did for these participants is that we looked at individual differences in quantitative reasoning ability in the top 1% among people with different terminal degrees, bachelor's, master's, and doctorates. And here we have our participants, over 500 of them, and we followed them for over 25 years, and we looked at their STEM publications, their publications in the humanities, all patents and Fortune 500 patents. We get significant differences for patents, but not much in the form of outcome. These are the participants who stopped their education at bachelor's degrees. Here are master's degrees. Here are doctorates. Now, when we submitted this study for consideration for publication, one of the referees, I think it was Stephen Ceci actually, said, well, you know, this is very interesting, but maybe what's going on here is this. Maybe these early test scores, the ones who scored exceptionally high, teachers were made aware of these scores, and what they did is they gave kids opportunities, and these opportunities further developed them, and they were able to secure admissions to the very top graduate schools in the country, and it's graduate schools who are responsible for their accomplishments. That's an interesting insight. So what we did in the revise and resubmit is we pulled off participants who got their graduate degrees in the top 15 graduate training programs in the US. You know the characters, MIT, Caltech, Harvard, Stanford, etc. And here are the participants in the top 15 graduate institutions. Look at their SAT math score, 740. The ceiling is 800. These scores have ceiling problems. Here are the other institutions. More ability matters. It's not everything, but it matters. Now, what about other abilities? Same population. What we did is we formed Tukey plots. We added up their SAT scores and plotted it on the y-axis. And then we subtracted to measure tilt their SAT math from their SAT verbal score. And this orthogonalizes the two dimensions. They're independent. So scores to the right are high math, scores to the left are high verbal. And here are people who ended their formal education after 4-year degrees. And you see that people in STEM and the humanities are equally able overall, but the STEM folks are a little more quantitatively able, and the verbal folks are a little more verbally able. Here are master's degrees. Here are MDs and JDs just for fun. You would imagine that lawyers are a little more verbal, and they are. Here are PhDs in the humanities and STEM. These ellipses, incidentally, are formed by plus or minus 1 standard deviation of the abilities. Now, you might look at that and say, well, yeah, they occupy different regions in the psychological space defined by these dimensions. They have PhDs. These are age 12 assessments. This individuality as a parent, you would never see this if you gave these kids the SAT when they were 18 years old and getting ready for college. They'd bump their head on the ceiling. You'd say they were high flat. Tenure track faculty positions in the top 10 US universities. And we plotted some points for law, medicine, and economics because they didn't fit in these categories. Makes sense? Here are their creative accomplishments. Look at where the novelists are. When you get to nonfiction, more grounded in reality because of the quantitative reasoning. C.P. Snow's chattering class. Now, I'm going to take this up to Mount Olympus and look at the profoundly gifted. A lot of you are neuroimagers. So what I'm going to do is say, what would you give to have a sample of 500 participants who had IQs above 160 to apply your tools to? Well, one thing I want to say is that's kind of exciting to me. I must say, I'd be interested to see what you find, but you have to be aware. Look at the psychological diversity in verbal reasoning ability among the top 1 in 10,000 in quantitative reasoning. That's why the SAT math score of 700 is put in red. SAT verbal score of 630, back when these kids were assessed, is the top 1 in 10,000. Look at their diversity of mathematical reasoning. Some kids are we're just around the top 1% in mathematical reasoning, but they're in the top 1 in 10,000 in verbal. Look at the diversity. Do these differences matter? These kids can do anything. Why don't they just choose what they like? Well, here are their graduate degrees. And we plotted every graduate degree that they earned in this space. And there were enough to connect with web-like dotted lines in the humanities, in law, and in STEM. And you have 3 elliptical tiers here. The inner ellipses are plus or minus 1 standard error of estimate. The outer ellipses are plus or minus 1 standard deviation. And these constellations of people with humanities degrees, law, STEM, occupy different regions. Here's the humanities, here's law, here's STEM. These are their graduate degrees. Occupations, same thing. Creativity. Now we have 2 STEM outcomes, publications or patents. Arts and humanities. They occupy different regions in this space. Now this is very interesting. One sample, though, top 1 in 10,000 in verbal quant reasoning. It's a replication crisis in psychology, but how do you get a sample like this? Well, a lot of you have been following the publications in molecular psychology by Robert Plomin's team, and he has been publishing lately on a group of participants who have IQs of 170. Here's how that group came about. In 2013, I did a sabbatical at Duke Tip, and Duke Tip has 25 years of talent search data, 2.5 million participants, and what we did for Robert's study and collaborating with him is we pulled out all the 160 plus IQs we could find. Now the luxury there is because we were doing DNA stuff, we don't care if the kids are 13 or 50, we just get their DNA. But it occurred to us, wait a minute, there's probably a subset of this SMPY sample, and this is the same scatter plot I showed you earlier. Here's the estimated IQs of 160. There's probably a subset in here that has the same age range as our participants. Long story short, there were 259 of them, and here they are. And what I'm going to do, on the bottom, you're going to see the 3 slides of outcomes that I just showed you and the extent to which they replicate in the Duke Tip sample, okay? Educational outcomes, graduate degrees. Occupational outcomes. Creative outcomes. The exact same space. This is a replication. In the article, I was at APA when we were developing this study, and I showed Bill Revell this data, and he said, David, what you have here is a generalization of the blink comparator from astronomy, where astronomers take photographs of the night sky to determine the structure and temporal trajectories of constellations of stars. Here you have constellations of psychological outcomes over time. Well, I really like that idea. And there happens to be an astrophysicist in the family, so I put that in our article, nice paragraph, showed him the data, and he said, yeah, I can see why you'd say that. I need to touch this up a little for you. So he touched it up, but it's in the article. So I was at a conference a few months ago, and Bill Revell is in the crowd, as he is now, sitting in back, last row, next to our postdoc. And he said, David, this is very nice the way you did this, but actually for the blink comparator, you got to put these ellipses on top of each other and show that they map on. So Bill Revell, these slides are for you. Graduate degrees plus occupations, graduate degrees plus occupations plus creativity, all in the same space. Now what I've done here is I've showed you the different regions, the qualitatively different outcomes that eventuate with these different constellations. What I haven't told you is the level of accomplishment. So I have a handout for you. Does everyone have one? If you don't, raise your hand. We'll get one to you. There are 2 people in back with the outcomes. If you turn the back slide, a number of normative outcomes, including doctorate degrees, doctorates from top 10 university, tenure, patents, publication, Fortune 500 outcomes, grants. You'll see that these are remarkable people. These are the individuals that Robert Plomin is genotyping, okay? These are incredible individuals. Back to the theory of work adjustment, talent development, as we call it now. I've talked about 2 abilities, verbal and quant. I haven't talked about spatial ability. Spatial ability is very important. Sometimes it's called the orphan ability because it's always neglected. Is it important? Does it add value beyond mathematical and verbal reasoning ability? Well, back in the late 70s, Julian Stanley had the presence of mind to give 556 participants who had taken the SAT at age 12 a series of spatial ability tests. We formed a composite, and this is based on a study that was published a few years ago, based on outcomes from their age 18 follow-up, age 23 follow-up, and age 33 follow-up. What we did is we scaled on the x-axis their quantitative reasoning ability, on the y-axis their verbal ability, and those are the bivariate points here. And then for spatial ability, arrows to the right are positive values, arrows to the left are negative values. If you imagine the positive values coming out from the page and the negative values going back, those arrowheads represent the trivariate points in multivariate space. Of favorite high school course, you see that of the participants who said math science is their favorite, they're high math, high space, relatively low verbal. The inverse is true for the humanities and social sciences. Remember, all these kids are in the top 1% of ability. Least favorite course, the inverse pattern. Bachelor's degrees, look at the computer science, look at the physical sciences. Graduate degrees, this heavy arrowhead is because it goes off the page. And occupations. All three of these abilities have incremental validity relative to the other two in predicting these outcomes. Now, the interesting thing about this is all these kids were aware they had to do well on the SAT at age 18 to get in the college they wanted to get in. No one was thinking about spatial ability. They probably don't even remember taking the test. This is how an individual differences attribute plays out, whether or not we measure it. Currently, modern day talent searchers miss about half of the top 1% in spatial ability by restricting assessments to exclusively verbal or quantitative reasoning. Now, again, the replication crisis. With a former student, Jonathan Way, we reviewed 50 years of research on spatial ability, going all the way back to an NSF report at the time of Sputnik that underscored back then the importance of quantitative reasoning and spatial visualization for capturing nascent physical scientists and engineers. We had a study based on 556 participants that we were proud of, but how does this fit in for non-talent search participants? What we did is we went into Project Talent, which is a stratified random sample of the nation's high schools, 400,000 participants in the US, grades 9 through 12, 100,000 students per grade, had conceptually equivalent, empirically interchangeable measures of spatial, verbal, and quantitative reasoning abilities. The outcomes were the same for all 4 grades, so we combined the results. Look at the numbers in parentheses for sample size. And the STEM participants are in dotted lines up here. Bachelor's, master's, doctorates. Pattern is important. Now, again, this is just pattern. I didn't say anything about ability level. Oh, occupations. Pattern is important. I didn't say anything about ability level. Here, we plotted their composite score on the 3 abilities, general intellectual ability. Here are the STEM folks. It's a very common hierarchy of educational degrees. STEM on top, education and business at the bottom, intermediate degrees. Now look at, even for education, this is over a 0.5 standard deviation above the normative mean. On the y-axis, we plotted their specific abilities, verbal space math, and the 3 tiers, terminal bachelors, terminal masters, doctorates. In addition to ability level, there's an important configural pattern here. All the STEM folks have spatial ability higher than their verbal ability, even though their verbal ability is commensurate with or higher than the other groups. There's a different intellectual configuration. This is the intellectual patterning of C.P. Snow's two cultures. The humanists, all the way down to the educators, have a different pattern. Now, talked about the world of work. What about creativity? This study was based on the 556 participants Julian measured in the late 70s. We looked up their creative outcomes at age 48. All this stuff is available on the internet. And we found that 27 of them had refereed publications in the arts. 35 had refereed publications in biology or medicine, 65 in STEM. We had 33 that had patents. These are mutually exclusive and exhaustive creative outcomes because if participants had a patent in a publication, we put them in the relevant publication group. And red are all the others. This is a three-dimensional representation of the three abilities, the trivariate points, and these ellipsoids now, I call this the Easter egg plot. The ellipsoids are defined by the three orthogonal orbits of the standard error of estimate. Okay? And you see that their creative outcomes occupy different regions. Here are the people who published in STEM, they're high on everything. This red, this little Pluto planet, standard error of estimate is small because of the sample size. I'm going to rotate this. Another. You see in this one, on spatial ability, people who get patents and publish in STEM are commensurate. But the people who publish in STEM are much higher on verbal and quantitative reasoning. This is the intellectual design space of creative thought. 3 dimensions. You can download this data, the R code's provided, so you can actually manipulate this with your mouse on your laptop. It's wonderful for teaching multivariate. Okay. Theory of work adjustment, theory of talent development. I've talked about abilities, why it's important to assess level in pattern in the top 1%. Motivational proclivities add value. I don't have time to go into it because I have to turn this back to Camilla to talk about lifestyle, which is important for talent development, and educational interventions because we can enhance the productivity of these kids through them. She's going to tell you about them. If you want to know about motivational proclivities and how this adds value, later today Brian Bernstein has a lovely poster on this, and I refer you to that. But right now, I'm going to turn it back to Camilla, and she's going to conclude. My work is over for the day.
All right. So I talked about earlier that when I was in my early 20s, I had this idea that I would follow up the participants for 50 years. And what I'm going to talk about today is the data from the first 2 cohorts. We always publish these things together because cohort 2 kind of replicates what we find for cohort 1. And so this, what is in the red box is the sample I'll be talking about today. I will tell you that we are collecting data right now as we speak on cohort 3, and we almost have 51% fully completed surveys from this group. Actually, it's also cohort 5 that we're collecting, and about 17% or 18% from partially completed. So we're almost getting there. But anyway, we're going to talk about cohort 1 and 2, but just know that 3 and 5 data is in progress, and we'll have more information down the road to see what happens. So in the midlife follow-up, so this is the average age of 50, I'd like to say that they were followed up at the same time. So when you look at the data, keep in mind that cohort 1 is about 5 years older than cohort 2. So, cohort 1 has had 5 more years to develop their professional lives and contributions than cohort 2. Puts cohort 2 at a slight disadvantage, but cohort 2 is also a little bit abler. They're a top 0.5% in ability, whereas cohort 1 was a top 1% in ability overall. Here you can see the sample sizes. Pretty robust. Okay, here are the highest degrees earned. And I think you can see here that that's, pretty comparable for males and females, especially for cohort 2, who were identified just a little bit later. And if you think about the women's movement in the 70s, there are some data points to keep in mind that women's movement really did seem to have an effect. We picked that up, that the early women just had a little different path than the later women we have identified. Here is the percentage who are employed full-time. One of the things you can see here is that the women in our sample are much less likely to be employed full-time. Here are their incomes. And you can see this is for a few years ago, they're likely to be higher. Yes, one hears that there's income stagnation in America. It tends to be at the lower levels more. So these probably have gone up some since that time. But again, I think if you look at that, you'll see the sex differences pretty large. Now this is the income of full-time workers. And you can see, even if you take away the individuals who work part-time, yes?
Is it personal income?
This is their personal income. But you can see here that there are some differences between the two groups. Males are earning more money than the females. Here is a slide of their occupational groups. You can see that actually the biggest job category for males tends to be CEOs, information technology, or STEM. Primarily here we're talking about the engineers, and also in post-secondary. Women have a little bit different spread of things. A lot of them are seen in post-secondary, but they're also seen as physicians and in the health sciences, as the next slide would show. But I'm going to let you look at this just for a few more seconds so you can take it all in. And here's the second slide. You can see, if you want to zoom down to the bottom, you see the health sciences, and you see teachers. You see the women are more represented there, as well as in general business. But I think the biggest contrast here is the full-time homemakers. Women are much more likely to stay at home and raise children. Here is the occupational stature. We tried to look at, okay, who are at the top? What percentage of the individuals have risen to the top? So we just took a few ways of capturing that kind of phenomenon. And you might have other definitions. Here are just a couple that we came up with to kind of see what percent of our participants in their chosen field have risen to the top. And I think you can see here that the base rates for these kinds of accomplishments are extremely low, and you can see that the individuals are represented here are many times the base rates. But you can also see that these individuals don't just stay in the STEM areas. You can see that they do become executives in business. The abilities that we measure are important for a variety of occupations. And again, you can see the sex differences. And they replicate across cohorts. What about creative accomplishments? Again, you can see This is a quite high rate of producing creative accomplishments. I think you can see that there are sex differences in terms of overall productivity, but also if you want to look at the data, you can see that the women and the men choose to focus their creative energies in slightly different ways. The females, if they're engaged in this type of work, tend to be more in the organic sciences. As you can look at the organic sciences publications and the NIH grants, there you can see, but let's contrast that with STEM publications and NSF grants, and NSF grants tend to be in the STEM areas. So you can see that the different patterns of grants that they are getting, and of course in terms of patents. So what you're seeing here is that certainly these women are are producing, are creative, are engaged, and when they are, they're doing extremely well, but they're tending to choose slightly different areas to focus their energies. So what about more about their personal lives? Sometimes what we hear in the literature is that, oh gosh, if you're gifted and female, you're going to have a hard time finding a spouse or a partner. Well, I think if you look at the data here, I really don't think that there's much there to support that view. I think it's slightly lower for the women, but nothing to write home about. But you can see a lot of them are either in married or in a committed relationship. It's much higher than the national rate. All right, so let's look at the incomes of married individuals versus unmarried individuals by sex, because I think it's pretty interesting. What you see is the median, and what you see the next two are the cutoffs for the top quartile and top decile. And so these are who have reached that cutoff. I think the interesting thing about this data is that if you look at the males who are married are earning more money than the males who are unmarried. You do not see that trend for the females. Similarly, you asked about incomes of families. Here are the incomes of the spouses of the participants in our study. Again, median cutoff for the top quartile and cutoff for the top decile. As you can see, for the males, the spouses earn much, much less on the whole. But that's not as strong of a relationship with our females. So you can, sometimes I like to say, oh, well, our females are marrying well financially. They're doing pretty well, and perhaps because of that, they're being able to stay at home. Here's cohort 2, the exact same thing. Very different trends. Now here, one of the things that we kind of looked at in the data is, well, why is there that difference in incomes and in accomplishments? Well, an obvious thing to kind of look at is how much time are you engaging in work? If you spend less time engaged in work, you're going to produce less. In terms of accomplishments, hard work is really important. Brilliance can only take you so far. Hard work takes you the rest of the way. So here we kind of tracked retrospectively and prospectively how the number of hours, so there's a self-report, the number of hours people worked 15 to 10 years ago, 10 to 5 years ago, and how they looked in the future. As you can see, the males are reporting that they are working more hours than the females. You can also see that it's kind of an interesting trend here, if you look at it, is that, you know, the males are kind of worked harder. They're all kind of working a little less with time, but the males especially are really thinking about dropping off with time. But you can see early on in their careers, they're working hard. They're putting in a lot of hours into work. Hard work matters. But there are differences, big differences between the males and females. If you look at time with family, including relatives, homemaking, and home maintenance, this is another way of work. And I think if anyone who raises kids will know that sometimes raising kids in a family is a lot harder than going to work. At least for me, it was a reprieve to go to work. So, it's like, people say, how did you raise so many kids, Camilla? Because I worked. So anyway, you can see the opposite pattern that in this sample, that the women are much engaged in the work of the family, homemaking, taking care of children. We asked them also, how many hours are you willing to work if you had the ideal job? Again, you can see the sex differences here. Men are just more willing to work longer hours than the females. Now, why is that? Let's get into some sex differences in work preferences and values and lifestyle works that might help explain some of that. So we asked them about what is, I guess we measured their work preferences and what's important to them in terms of their work preferences. At the top here, you see we calculated effect sizes and we took the male minus the female. So at the top here are the things that males thought were more important than the females. And basically, they want to earn a lot of money. They'll take risks. They like to work with things. They want a challenging job, prestige, and so on. That's what's more important for the males than the females. I'm not saying that it isn't important for the females. What?
What age was that measured? Was it before their accomplishments?
No, this was, I think we had measured this in the mid-30s. Wasn't it the mid-30s?
Well, it depends on if you're talking about your age. These are results from our midlife follow-up. So for cohort 1, 53, for cohort 2, 48.
So it's concurrent measure.
Yeah.
But we also did have some of this earlier too. And here we have, if you look at the females, you can see that working part-time is important, being able to work on my own, flexibility to work at home, respecting coworkers, and you can see working no more than 40 hours per week and so on. You can see that what the women in terms of work preferences, they really wanted to have flexibility with their time. Of course, and I want to be clear, this is an aggregate. On average, there are crazy people like myself who don't fit that pattern. And what about personal views? And here, you kind of one of the biggest differences is that the men feel that society should invest in my ideas because they are more important than those of others. Discomforting others does not deter me from stating the facts. Receiving criticism from others does not inhibit me from expressing my thoughts. I have the capacity for sustained physical activity. I'm able to control my emotions when it is appropriate to do so. And I want to be recognized as the best in my field. That's very important much more important to the males than the females in our sample. And what about the females? Society has a responsibility to meet the basic needs of all of its members. It's important to me that no one goes without. So you can kind of say that the males in our sample are a little bit more individually focused, individualistic, and the females are more community focused. What about life values? And again, here we have the males having a full-time career, inventing, creating something, having lots of money, being successful. Those are really important life values for them. And here, where you can draw the line, you can start seeing where the females come out. And again, giving back to the community, spiritual life, time with my children every day, healthy diet, community service, time to socialize, being there for family and friends, not working outside of home, strong friendships, part-time career. As I kind of look at all of this, you really have, in terms of creating a life for yourself, there are different variables that are at play for the males and the females overall. Remember, again, it's not all males and all females, there's overlap. But if you take the general trends, the men are much, what I would say, as a female, much more narrowly focused. They're focused on their careers, having impact, developing a strong reputation, and making a lot of money. That's the men. The women in our sample say, that's all important to me too. However, there are all these other things in life that are important as well. My friends, my family, my community. We all are given 24 hours in a day. That drives how we use those 24 hours. And I think the men tend, given consistent with their values and their interests, are focusing much more narrowly on their career and their self-development, and the females are a little bit more broader focused. To lead a satisfying life for the women, that requires many more variables than the males. So the women have many more balls in the air than the males. But to lead a satisfying life, to create a satisfying life, there are many more components that came into it for the women in our sample. Now you can say, well, how do they feel about their accomplishments and their lives? Are they equally satisfied? I think if you look at this slide, you can basically say that, first of all, these individuals are extremely satisfied with the direction of their lives. Kind of went off the scale almost. But there are essentially no differences. So they are creating different lives, and they are very satisfied with the lives that they are creating for themselves. In terms of psychological well-being, again, you can see there are really no differences at all. I'm going to just quickly go to the educational interventions. One of the things that Julian created was these talent searches, and in America, he started off with 452 individuals in a talent search to find these gifted individuals. He did it 6 times before he created a center at Hopkins called the Center for Talented Youth, and then went down to Duke and developed a TIP talent search. And basically, it's almost, for gifted individuals in America, it's almost a rite of passage to participate in a talent search these days. Almost 200,000 kids annually participate in these talent searches. And when I think about having impact, to think that you started this idea. First it was one kid, and then you developed a talent search concept, and now here in 2017, the first one was conducted in 1972, and in 2017, it's just part of our educational system in America, and 200,000 kids participate. But Julian always felt that you can't just identify these gifted kids and help them understand their abilities. If you identify them, you have a responsibility to help them use their talents well, to challenge them. And so he developed and worked with a lot of kinds of interventions to see what works. Because if you're already scoring, say, 700 on the SAT math at the top 5% of college-bound seniors, and you're in 7th grade, perhaps you need an adjustment in your math curriculum. Perhaps the regular math class isn't really challenging for you. So he tried all kinds of different things. Now, we tried all kinds, as I said, different things. And much of the early work that was done was kind of comparing, well, is AP taking an advanced placement class better, or an honors class better than taking a college course as a high school student, or taking a summer program, or doing research in a lab? What, we always having these binary comparisons. Well, one day we kind of said, no, maybe it doesn't really matter exactly what you do. The main thing is that you're stimulated, that you're stimulating your brain. Exercise builds muscle, educational stimulation builds the brain muscles. So we decided that we were just going to count up for each individual, it's a very rough thing, the number of intellectually stimulating activities that they participated in that went beyond a normal curriculum. The things that are not normally done are typically done, so these are the special things. And so we decided to put individuals into a high dose, those individuals who were exposed to many different educationally challenging opportunities, and a low dose group who weren't exposed to it. Now we did a cutoff here because this is STEM, that we only looked at individuals who had at least a 500 on the SAT math, which is the average score of a college-bound senior in high school, college-bound 18-year-old. So we knew that all of the individuals here had potential to do extremely well in the STEM areas. And so what we did was to say, let's look at that STEM dose and to see if dose matters in terms of outcomes for PhDs, STEM publications, tenure in a STEM discipline, patent, occupations. So here we have, you can see the differences between the high dose and the low dose. And you can see for the first, and we have the basically cohort 1, 2, and 3 in this sample. And you can see that for cohort 1 and 2, the differences there are quite a few differences, that those individuals who were exposed to a high dose of intellectually stimulating activities did much better than those who were exposed to a low dose. The differences for cohort 3, and cohort 3, the top 1 in 10,000 group, were smaller. But when we looked at the data and dug into the data, what we realized was that for those individuals, even things like AP classes were not stimulating enough. And it was those individual opportunities that were created for these kids that made a difference. And so there's just a point where you're so bright that even the things that we can have at our disposal to try and throw at these kids, it's just not stimulating enough. So you have to kind of, with those top 1 in 10,000, you kind of have to individualize the interventions. This next study was that one of the things that Julian worked with at the beginning was, and I remember back in the 1970s, there weren't many options to play with these gifted kids, as it is compared today. It really is better today than it was. And so what he experimented with was grade skipping, because if he looked in the literature, he could see that skipping grades really had strong positive effects. Now, most people think, oh gosh, this is a terrible thing to do, but he looked into literature and said, this is really, looks like it's really efficacious. And it doesn't seem to have negative impact on social and emotional development. So here what we did was we took those individuals in our sample who had skipped grades, and we compared them to individuals who had not. And we did a matching on 14 variables using propensity score matching. And you can see these are the differences in blue before the matching and after the matching. So they're pretty darn closely matched. So here, in terms of doctoral degrees, you can see that the individuals who skip grades earn more doctoral degrees than the ones who did not. STEM graduate degrees, same pattern. And we did it here by SAT score, so you can see. Publications. Patents. there isn't that much of a difference in patterns. Now, a lot of people could say, well, if you skip a grade, 1 or 2 or 3, because some of these kids skip that many, some went to college at 13 or 14. Sure, they have a head start, so of course they can do more. They have all these years. So we tried to see, do the effects diminish with time? Do the ones who didn't skip grades eventually catch up with the grade skippers? And you can see here that they did not. There is that constant. Again, with STEM PhDs, STEM publications, patents. You can see that there's individuals who accelerated in high school, got a head start on their careers, started producing earlier, and just kept producing earlier. And here you have them all in one slide. And you can see. It's pretty clear. So what I like to say here is, of course, these are quasi-experimental. There could be variables that we couldn't adjust to, so it's not an experimental design. But there are very few studies out there that can show impact of educational interventions done in the teenage years and to find differences in the mid-40s to early 50s. Very few data points that can show that long-term effects. As a matter of fact, we were kind of surprised that we could see these strong effects because we kind of thought that the vicissitudes of time would maybe wash out those differences. But you can see that they did not. And allow me just to say, while I do not show the data up here, in terms of social and emotional development, and I know how parents feel because I went through the same struggles myself and just decided, gee, if I'm telling other parents to accelerate the kids, and here I had a kid who needed to be accelerated, I better bite the bullet myself. And it's a hard decision. I understand the decision, but all the data shows, and I did not show that data here, that there is no impact on their social and emotional development. If anything, the impacts are positive. If anything, it's in a positive direction. But the effect sizes are so small that I wouldn't say that. But that would be the trend. So we have data here that, yes, when we identify kids in their teens, we intervene educationally, that this makes a difference in the long term. And that these individuals, and that is to the benefit of our own society, because the contributions that these individuals make help society. Yes, they may earn more money themselves, but the kinds of things that they're engaged in move society forward. So it's in our best interest to engage those kids and to develop their talents. It's best for us in the long run. So thank you. And I had one more slide? Oh, yes. Sorry. I don't know if there's any more questions, or we're running out of time.
I think after that, if people have got a couple of questions, we should.
Yes. Well, early on, when we were working with Julian worked with these students. I mean, he loved to work with these students individually. But we really made sure that this information went out to all of our kids so that they would be informed. But there is, of course, we can, I mean, that's why I said this is a quasi-experimental design. We threw everything that we could at it to kind of make those groups be as similar as possible. But there are variables that we didn't have measures on that could be affecting all of this. It's also the kids' motivations themselves, because it's not just the parents. Many of the parents, what they said is, I'm responding to the child. We didn't really have kids in here who were pushing their kids hard. I mean, yes, they were challenging them, but when we asked them what about their parenting strategies and what they were doing, they said, really, what I did was to respond to the child and their needs. So that I would say that it's perhaps more that of things still that we couldn't adjust for in motivation of the child, because if the child doesn't want to be accelerated, you're not going to accelerate a child who does not want to be accelerated. That's just not a good idea.
Did females want to be accelerated less?
Somewhat less.
Just friendships?
Somewhat less than, yeah, they were somewhat less. That's why we always encourage, when it comes to females and you have a talented female, our advice was always enter them into school early. Because first of all, they're more mature than the males, so they have better, and so they are better able to handle it. But also then they're with a friendship group and you don't have to break up their friendships, which is something very important to them. So we always felt that that was one of the best things you could do if you had a female. Overall, if there's anything, again, generally good things come together. These are kids who are very well adjusted. If you look at their personalities, they're well adjusted, stable, and they're a little bit mature for their age.
More question, Toby?
Yeah, I noticed that if you took both cohorts 1 and 2, there were a lower percentage of females than males in both cohorts, and the more able cohort 2, there was a lower percentage of women than in cohort 1. Is that a pattern that's repeated across the cohorts, and what's your explanation for that?
Well, there are various differences on ability measures, abilities that are on top of each other, and males tend to be more variable. That's why, it's interesting. People don't play this out usually, but the averages are pretty close, and we all know that there are an overabundance of males with all kinds of developmental delays. Also an overabundance of males. Top end, and males are more variable.
So your research essentially confirms that it's nothing to do with selection bias.
But there are even broader normative studies on this, broader talent search studies on this, and intelligence. Jonathan Ray has a piece in 2010 where he analyzed the Duke tip participants over 30 years, and he found the upper-tail ratio differently. Ian Beery has done that in Edinburgh. It's a very robust finding. Rosalind has done this herself.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the people who participate in talent searches today, actually slightly more females than males participate. But on the SAT math, you have a higher proportion of males.
So in summary, the school system retards bright children.
Some questions sum up.
It's the school system. If you don't challenge them, you lose them. And I think that was what motivated Julian in the first place. He was really afraid that if these individuals weren't challenged and given special opportunities, that their love of learning that they had would be snuffed out. And he wanted to intervene in those years to keep their love of learning, their passions alive, so that by the time they got to the university, and sometimes, of course, he got them there early, But by the time they got there, they're still engaged. And the most important thing of all is that they learn how to learn. Because so many of our kids, as I say, major in IQ. But if you don't challenge them, they never learn how to learn. And this is one of the more interesting things when we did our paced math classes. And I still run programs, so while we do these research, wherever I go, the provosts say, can you please start programs for us? So I did it at Iowa State, we started them at Vanderbilt. But it is, so we do our math classes, and what we do in those fast-paced math classes is to diagnose when they come what they know and what they don't know. And then we put out a curriculum that just focuses on the things that they don't already know. So if you have a class of 30 students, they're all working on different things because we're filling in holes. And there's always the same reaction every time. I always smile because I just wait to see how it's going to happen, because this is the first time that these kids have been challenged, really. And immediately their hands go up. And all of them in the class, their hands go up. But I don't know how to do this. And I said, yeah, that's right. Well, I don't know how to do this. I said, well, did you read the materials beforehand? Well, no. Did you work through the sample problems? Well, no. Did you look in the glossary? Well, no. These kids don't know how to learn because they have never needed to, because they always knew the stuff before it was taught. And I think that's what's so important here, and that's what Julian wanted to prevent, was to make sure that kids came learning how to learn. Because if you don't learn it, what we saw with some of our kids who were never challenged is that if you develop an identity that I can do this work without putting in any effort, you eventually come to a place where you actually have to put in effort. And they don't know how to cope. Emotionally, socially, because their identity is that I can just do it like this, but they also don't have the skills to do it. A long answer, but it's something, as you can tell, my little passionate part of this work.
It's really a good place to end because this is general to all students. The concept is, and Julian said this repeatedly, all kids have the right to learn something new every day. That's what we're trying to do here. There are laws for kids with developmental delays to make sure they get their educational needs met. There are no laws for the gifted.
Actually, there are laws, but they aren't done.
In fairness to our next two speakers, we should
Great.